The champagne was good. Maya knew this because she had nothing else to pay attention to. And so she'd taken a long, slow sip, studying the bubbles, cataloging the dryness, deciding that, yes, this was probably a $400 bottle, while her husband of 4 hours stood across the master suite of his penthouse and looked at her the way people look at a piece of furniture they didn't order but had to keep anyway. Jeong Jae-Won had changed out of his wedding suit. He wore a simple black dress shirt now, collar open at the throat, sleeves rolled to his forearms with the kind of careless precision that rich men practiced until it looked effortless. He was reviewing something on his phone. He had been reviewing something on his phone for 11 minutes. Maya had counted. She set her champagne flute on the nightstand, her nightstand, the one on the left, which had been designated hers by a member of his household staff who had explained the room's layout with the same detached professionalism of a flight attendant going over emergency exits. She sat on the edge of the bed. She had not changed out of her dress yet. It was ivory, because white felt presumptuous, and she had chosen it herself, and she thought it was beautiful even if no one had said so. "You don't have to hover," Jae-Won said, without looking up. "I'm sitting." Hovering implies uncertainty about where you belong. He finally looked up. His eyes moved over her with the impassive efficiency of a scanner. "The uncertainty is understandable, but it's my home, so I'd prefer you settle on a behavior and commit to it." Maya looked at him. She had a gift. People had told her this her whole life, usually when they were annoyed by it, of looking at someone and making them feel seen in a way they hadn't consented to. She turned this gift on her husband now, took him in, noted the deliberate distance he'd placed between them, the way he'd positioned himself near the window, close to an exit, noted the tension in his jaw that his neutral expression was trying to cover. He was not comfortable either. He was just better at pretending. "I'm not uncertain," she said calmly. "I'm tired. It was a long day." Something crossed his face, not quite surprise, more like a recalibration. He'd expected something else from her defensiveness, maybe, or that particular kind of overperformed dignity that people used like armor. He hadn't expected simple. He put his phone in his pocket. "We should establish the terms again," he said, face to face, "so there's no ambiguity. We signed the contract, Jae-Won. Mr. Jeong." The room was very quiet. Maya breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. She thought about the contract, 31 pages, reviewed by a lawyer her father's former business partner had found for her. A kind woman named Sandra who had read every clause twice and said, "This is unusual, but it's legal," in a tone that held more pity than Maya wanted to receive. "Mr. Jeong," she said. Flat, clean, no irony. He nodded, apparently satisfied. "The contract is clear. 2 years. You maintain the appearance of a functioning marriage for the purposes of my family obligations and any public engagements that require it. In exchange, your father's debt to my family, all 47 million won, is cleared, and he keeps the business license he would otherwise lose." He paused. "You receive a monthly allowance, access to household accounts for reasonable personal expenses, a room in this apartment, and the use of the house in Seongbuk-dong when I'm traveling." "I know," Maya said. "I was there when we negotiated it. What I want to make clear." He stopped. His jaw shifted. She watched him choose his words with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned that words, deployed incorrectly, could detonate things. "This is a transaction, not a relationship. I want no confusion about that." "There's no confusion. You are not someone I would have chosen." It landed. She felt it land, a flat, clean impact, like a hand pressed against a bruise. She made sure none of that showed on her face. She was very good at that. "And you're not someone I would have chosen either," she said. "So we're even." He studied her. She held his gaze the way she'd learned to hold difficult things steadily, without gripping. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. It didn't sound like a compliment. It didn't sound like anything, really. It sounded like a data point he was filing away. "No," Maya agreed. "I'm not." She reached over, picked up her champagne, finished it, and stood. "I'm going to shower and go to sleep," she said. "You can continue being formally cold from wherever you prefer. Good night, Mr. Jeong." She walked past him toward the bathroom. She did not look back. She heard nothing from him, no response, no sound of movement, and she closed the bathroom door and stood with her back against it in the steam-warm dark for exactly 30 seconds. Then she turned on the shower, and she did not cry. She had decided a long time ago that she was done crying over people who didn't see her. She just had to get through 2 years. That was all. Her father's name was Raymond Davis, and he was a man who loved large. That was the only way Maya had ever known how to describe him: large. Large laugh, large dreams, large promises, large failures. He'd moved the family from Atlanta to Seoul when Maya was 19, chasing a business opportunity that a Korean-American college friend had told him was basically printing money. It was not printing money. It was a mid-sized import business with good margins and terrible management, and Raymond Davis had promptly fallen in love with the chaos of it and invested everything they had. For 3 years, it worked. Then, it didn't. The details of how her father had come to owe money to the Jeong family were long and complicated and involved 2 failed ventures: a flood that wiped out a warehouse and a loan that had seemed, at the time, like a lifeline. The Jeong family were not loan sharks. They were simply a family of significant wealth and longer memory. And when Raymond Davis could not repay, they'd come to a conversation with a proposal that Maya had listened to in silence and then spent 4 days refusing before she finally, reluctantly, said yes, because the alternative was her father in legal ruin. Because Raymond Davis, for all his largeness, had a bad heart and a worse relationship with stress, and Maya had watched what the weight of this had done to him over 2 years: the graying, the stillness that replaced the bigness, the way he'd stopped laughing as loud, and she had decided that this was a thing she could do. She was used to doing the hard things. Her mother, Diana, was a woman who loved in the way some people breathed technically, because it was necessary, but without any particular enthusiasm for the process. Maya had grown up understanding that her mother was present in a physical sense and somewhere else in every other sense, and she had stopped waiting for Diana to turn toward her, somewhere around age 11. By 14, she was cooking for herself and her father. By 16, she was managing the household when Raymond Davis's dreams took him out of town for weeks at a stretch. By 22, she had a degree in communications, a job at a small Seoul-based PR firm, and the very clear understanding that she was not going to wait for anyone to take care of her. She did not tell people she was lonely. She barely told herself. What she had instead was clarity, an almost unsettling ability to see people without the static of her own wishes distorting the signal. She watched how people moved through rooms, what they said and what they didn't say, what they reached for when they were afraid. She'd learned this in self-defense. When your mother looks through you, you spend a lot of time studying faces, trying to decode what you might have missed, what might explain the distance. Eventually, she stopped trying to decode her mother and just turned the skill outward. It made her very good at her job. Her clients called her perceptive. Her coworkers called her unreadable. Her one serious boyfriend, Marcus, a kind architect from Busan, who she'd dated for 2 years, and ultimately let go because she could feel him trying to build a version of her that fit more neatly into his life, had called her too self-contained, which she thought was probably accurate and definitely not something she was going to apologize for. She was not difficult to love. She was simply not going to make herself smaller to make love easier. And so she had arrived at this, 27 years old, standing in the master suite of a penthouse in Gangnam, married to a man who had looked at her on their wedding day with polite indifference, and feeling, mostly okay actually, scared, yes, but okay. She'd survived things people didn't know about. She could survive this. The penthouse had 4 bedrooms. Jae-Won gave her the one at the opposite end of the hall from his, which she understood to be intentional and did not take personally. It was a beautiful room, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River, a bathroom with heated floors, a closet that was larger than the studio apartment she'd been renting in Mapo. His household manager, a meticulous woman named Park Seo-yeon, who seemed to run on efficiency and very good posture, had stocked the room with basic necessities and given Maya a schedule of the building's facilities and the household's routines. There was a schedule. Of course there was a schedule. Maya pinned it to the corkboard above the desk in her room and added her own notes in the margins in red pen, because she was not going to disappear into someone else's structure without leaving marks of her own. The first week was architecture. They built the geography of their coexistence. Jae-Won left the apartment at 6:45 every morning and returned between 8 and 10 at night. He ate dinner at his desk or in the car most evenings. On the rare nights he ate at home, Seo-yeon prepared something, and he ate it alone in the dining room in the time it took Maya to brew a cup of tea. He did not invite her. She did not impose. She kept her own hours, left for her PR firm job in Sinchon at 9, came back in the early evening, cooked her own food in the kitchen during off hours, cleaned up after herself with the kind of thoroughness that was not performative but was also, she knew, a quiet declaration. I take up space carefully and I don't leave messes. They spoke when they needed to. Seo-yeon had established a shared calendar for required appearances, Jae-Won's family dinners, social events, a few key functions where his marital status would need to be evidenced by an actual spouse. Maya blocked these dates, wore the appropriate things, performed the appropriate warmth. She was good at performance when it was honest, and there was a kind of honesty in being exactly who she was in spaces that expected something different. The first family dinner was the hardest. The Jeong family home in Seongbuk-dong was the kind of house that had been designed to communicate something. It communicated it loudly. Jae-Won's mother, Madame Jeong Eun-suk, was a slim, elegant woman in her 60s who looked at Maya with the focused attention of someone studying a problem they had not expected to become permanent. His father, the elder chairman Jeong, said almost nothing, and needed to say nothing. The weight of him filled the room and made everything around him slightly more formal. There was a younger sister, Jae-eun, who was 25 and the only person at the table who smiled at Maya with anything approaching warmth. There was an aunt who asked, in Korean, that she apparently assumed Maya would not understand whether the girl was really going to be acceptable. There was a cousin who stared. Maya had spent 6 months in intensive Korean language study before the marriage and could follow approximately 80% of the conversation, which she knew was approximately 80% more than anyone at the table suspected. She filed away the aunt's comment. She ate her dinner. She responded gracefully to the questions directed at her, in Korean when she could, in English when the vocabulary failed her. Watching Jae-Won's face for cues and finding nothing there, his dinner table face was a mask of attentive neutrality, agreeing with his father in measured tones, redirecting his mother's pointed inquiries with the efficiency of a man who had been doing this his whole life. In the car home, they didn't speak. She watched the city lights and thought that she understood something about him she hadn't before. He was not just guarded with her, he was guarded with everyone. The warmth she'd half expected to see him deploy for his family, the softening that people usually showed in the presence of people who loved them, was simply not there. Either it was buried very deep, or someone had taught him to close it off so completely he'd forgotten where he'd put it. It started small. She noticed that he always came home to music. Not loud music, something ambient and low, classical or modern instrumental, that Seo-yeon apparently had standing instructions to start 30 minutes before his estimated arrival, so that the apartment breathed differently when he walked in than it did at other times of day. She found this oddly touching when she figured it out. The idea of a man who needed a room to feel a certain way before he could enter it. She noticed that he ate poorly. Not carelessly, the food Seo-yeon prepared was excellent, but sparingly, without attention, in the way people eat when food is fuel and nothing else. She had grown up in a house where cooking was one of the few genuine forms of love available, and she had absorbed this without knowing it, and she found herself mildly offended, on a cellular level, by the joylessness of how he ate. She started leaving food. Not in a significant way, not in a way that required acknowledgement. She'd cook something for herself in the evenings, jollof rice, or the braised short rib her father had taught her. Or sometimes just a very good soup, and she'd make enough for 2 and leave the second portion in the refrigerator with a post-it that said nothing except the name of the dish and reheating instructions. The first time, it sat in the refrigerator for 2 days and she assumed he'd either thrown it away or not noticed. On the third morning, the container was in the dish rack. Clean. Returned. She made sure her expression said nothing when she saw it. He said nothing about it. This became a rhythm. She cooked. He ate what she left. Silently. Late at night when she was already in her room. The container was always clean in the morning. It was such a strange, quiet negotiation, a language with no words, and she thought about it more than she probably should have. The observation that shifted something was smaller still. She came home one Thursday evening to find him in the living room unusual. He was rarely there sitting in the armchair near the window, not with his phone or a laptop, but with a book, a thick paperback whose spine was cracked with heavy use. He was reading with the concentration of someone who had left the room entirely, gone somewhere the words were taking him, and for a moment, standing in the entryway, still in her coat, keys in hand, she saw him without the architecture of his defenses. He looked younger. He looked like a person. He looked up. The architecture returned instantly, the composed expression, the measured gaze. But for a half-second before it did, there was something unguarded in his eyes that she had not seen before. Something a little like startlement. Like he'd forgotten, briefly, that he was supposed to be alone. "You're home early," he said. "My last meeting was canceled." She hung her coat. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't." She passed through toward the kitchen. She had learned not to linger in his vicinity without a reason, not because she was afraid of him, but because she respected that he had calibrated the apartment to his own emotional needs, and she was trying not to disrupt that equilibrium unnecessarily. But then he said, quietly, without looking up from his book, "What do you see in people?" She stopped, turned. He was still looking at the book. "My sister said you have a way of reading people." She found it uncomfortable. She meant it as a complaint. Maya considered this. "And you?" He looked up then. His eyes were very dark, and they did that scanning thing she'd noticed that about him. The way he gathered information through his eyes. The way he looked at things like he was trying to count their components. "I'm asking," he said, "whether it's a technique or a natural thing." "It's just paying attention," she said. "Most people don't, so when you do, it reads as something else." He considered this the way he considered most things from a distance, turned over carefully. Then he went back to his book. She went to the kitchen, but something had shifted, slightly, in the way the apartment breathed. 3 months in. There was an event, the kind of event that had a capital letter name and required capital letter effort. The Jeong Group's annual international gala, where approximately 400 people in exceptional clothing would gather in a hotel ballroom to circulate, see, be seen, make deals wrapped in the language of philanthropy, and assess each other's marriages with the subtle aggression of people who had turned social performance into an Olympic sport. Jae-Won's mother called to confirm the attendance of the wife in a tone that was technically polite and actually instructional. Seo-yeon forwarded Maya a list of designers and stylists. The implication was clear. This was not a casual event, and whatever Maya had been doing up to this point, showing up appropriately dressed to family dinners, competently managing the performance of their marriage at smaller gatherings, was the warm-up. This was the main stage. Maya called her friend Kezia, who worked in fashion PR, and understood both the stakes and Maya's particular aesthetic philosophy, and they had a very direct conversation. "They're going to want you glamorous," Kezia said. "Red carpet glamorous. Korean chaebol wife glamorous. I know, but you're not going to do something that doesn't feel like you, correct?" "Okay," she could hear Kezia thinking. "So we find what glamorous means for you, which is not the same thing as what it means for them." This was the distinction that mattered. Maya was not, by disposition, a sequins and elaborate updo person. She was structural. She liked clean lines, interesting texture, things that looked considered rather than performed. She liked her hair natural. Her locks had grown to her shoulders, and she wore them in ways that felt like herself. Pulled back when she wanted, loose when she wanted, decorated when the occasion asked for it. Kezia found the dress. A designer out of Lagos working in Seoul, deep jewel tones. A deep emerald that looked, against Maya's skin, like something that had been waiting for her specifically. The cut was architectural, a structure of fabric that moved when she moved, that required nothing of her body except to inhabit it with confidence, which she had in sufficient supply. She did her own makeup. She knew her face. She put her locks up a crown of them, pinned and arranged with intention, a few loose at her temples, gold at her ears. Nothing at her throat. She'd decided her collarbone was enough. She stood in front of the mirror in her room for a long moment. She looked like herself. She looked like herself turned up. When she came out, Jae-Won was waiting in the foyer, in a tuxedo that had been fitted with the kind of precision that made off the rack look like a concept from another civilization. He was on his phone, of course he was on his phone, and he glanced up with the automatic, assessing look, he gave everything, and he stopped. Not dramatically. Not in the way it happens in films, where time slows and music swells. It was a very quiet, stopping a brief, absolute interruption of whatever signal his brain had been processing. His eyes took her in, and for a moment his expression did something complicated. Calculation overlapping with something less calculated. The processor encountering something it didn't have a ready response for. He looked away. Looked at his phone. You look. He paused. Appropriate. Maya reached for her evening bag. High praise. He said nothing, but when they walked to the elevator, she noticed that he held the door slightly longer than necessary, and when it closed, he stood a half step closer than he usually maintained. She noted this. She filed it. The gala was, as promised, 400 people, and the particular energy of rooms where everyone is performing something. Maya had done events like this for clients. She understood the grammar of them. She moved through the room at Jae-Won's side, and slightly behind, close enough to be legible as his wife, far enough that she wasn't crowding him, watching how the space organized itself around him with the fluid, automatic deference of people who knew exactly what he represented. He was very good at this. She'd known he would be. What she hadn't fully understood was how much it cost him. She saw it in micro-expressions she'd learned to read over 3 months of paying careful attention. The slight tightening at the corner of his mouth when he smiled for someone he didn't respect. The flatness in his eyes during conversations he found performative. He was flawless and utterly hollow-eyed in his flawlessness, doing this with the competence of someone for whom it had never been a choice. She found herself, unexpectedly, moved by this. There was a man from a competing firm who took her hand and held it a half beat too long during an introduction, addressing himself entirely to Jae-Won as though she had only ceremonial existence. She smiled graciously and waited for the conversation to create an opening, and then, in fluent Korean, asked the man a specific question about the firm's recent expansion into the European market, a question that demonstrated she'd read about it, that she had opinions, that she was a participant rather than an ornament. The man blinked at her, reassessed. She felt Jae-Won's attention shift slightly toward her. Later, near the terrace, he found her standing a moment alone. She'd excused herself from a conversation for a quiet minute, and he came to stand beside her in the way they developed, close enough for legibility, and he looked out at the city and said, almost to himself, "You knew the weighing acquisition figures. I did my homework. For an event. For a room full of people I was going to be judged by. Yes, a beat." "They weren't judging you," he said. Of course they were. She looked at the skyline, but not in the way they expected to. That's the point. Silence. Then, quietly, with something that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "No, I don't suppose it was." A woman moved through the crowd toward them, expensively dressed, classically beautiful, with the easy confidence of someone who had spent her whole life certain she deserved rooms like this. She looked at Jae-Won with the particular warmth of old familiarity, and then at Maya with the particular assessment of someone recalibrating a threat. "Jae-Won," she said. "I wasn't sure you were coming." "Hana." His voice was very neutral. The woman Hana glanced at Maya with a smile that was technically warm. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." "Maya?" Maya said. "His wife." She extended her hand with a steadiness she'd learned to locate somewhere in her sternum, a place that didn't shake even when other parts of her wanted to. Hana shook it. The conversation that followed was polite and precisely calculated on both sides. And when Hana finally drifted away into the crowd, Jae-Won didn't say anything for a moment. Then, she and I were… I know, Maya said simply. You don't have to explain. Another pause. He turned to look at her directly, which he didn't always do. You did that very well. Which part? All of it. It was the most direct compliment he had offered her in 3 months. She looked back at the skyline. I've been doing all of it my whole life, she said. I'm used to holding difficult things steadily. He didn't respond to that. But he stayed beside her longer than the social optics required, and he didn't take out his phone. Jae-Won had a business trip to Jeju in month 5. He was, apparently, in the habit of using the Seongbuk-dong house as a halfway point. For certain trips, it was quieter than the penthouse, closer to the mountain, and had a garden that backed against a hillside and felt, in the right weather, like you'd stepped outside the century. He'd mentioned, with his usual economy of words, that she was welcome to use the house while he was traveling. She went for a long weekend, mostly to be somewhere that didn't carry the specific atmospheric weight of their shared penthouse. The garden was better than she'd expected. Old stone paths, the kind of trees that had grown beyond anyone's management of them, something that might have been a meditation garden at some point in the house's long history. She sat out there the second evening with tea and a book and the specific luxury of being fully alone with no performance required of her. She heard footsteps at 9:30 and looked up to find Jae-Won walking through the garden gate. I thought you were staying an extra night, she said. The meetings ran long. I came back tonight instead. He stopped when he saw her, not startled, but recalibrating. He was in a suit jacket he'd removed the tie from, sleeves down, and he looked tired in a way she'd never seen on him before. Because she'd never seen him when he dropped his guard in the company of anyone. He didn't leave. He sat down in the other chair, the one facing hers, across the stone table, at the correct distance, and said nothing. And after a moment, she realized he had simply run out of the energy required to be somewhere other than here. She let the silence sit. She was good at silences. She'd grown up in them. Eventually, he said, My father wants me to begin the succession announcement this quarter. She looked at him. Is that what you want? He made a small, precise sound that was almost a laugh. What I want has not historically been the primary consideration. Then what is the primary consideration? What is appropriate? He said it flatly, without bitterness, which was more revealing than bitterness would have been. What is expected? What maintains the correct trajectory? Maya turned this over. Do you believe in what the company does? He looked at her. What? The Jeong Group. The work. Do you believe it matters? Or is it just a structure you move through? The question seemed to cost him something. He looked at the garden. The trees were dark shapes against the lighter dark of the sky, and somewhere something was making small sounds in the undergrowth. Parts of it matter to me, he said finally. The logistics division. The infrastructure projects. There's work there that is… He paused, choosing genuinely significant. That affects how real people move through the world, but it is all held inside a larger structure that I did not design and cannot fully alter, and which expects things from me that are… Another pause. Comprehensive. Comprehensive, she repeated, meaning total. He said nothing, which was confirmation. She looked at him for a long moment. He was very still in the way that people are still when they're holding something heavy and don't want to show the effort. She thought about what it must be like to be that much someone else's expectation, from birth, with no off-ramp, no exit, not even language for the wanting of one. I think, she said carefully, that you are a person who has gotten very, very good at being what is required of him, and I think you believe on some level that this is the same thing as being who you actually are. He turned to look at her. His expression was not quite readable, something between the controlled mask and the unguarded face she'd seen that one evening in the living room, some intermediate exposure. You don't know who I am, he said. Quiet, not hostile. No, she agreed. But I know the difference between someone who's chosen a life and someone who is placed in one. And I know what it looks like to be very, very tired of performing. A long silence. "My sister thinks you're lonely," he said. "Your sister's right." He looked at her, really looked at her, which was different from his usual scanning. Something in his face opened for a moment, a fault line in the smoothness. "So am I," he said. And then, as though he'd said something he hadn't planned, he looked back at the garden. They sat there for another hour without speaking. But it was the first silence between them that felt like a choice, rather than a gap. He found her in the kitchen at 11:30 on a Sunday, because she was stress baking, something she'd been doing since adolescence, turning anxiety into bread or cookies or, on one memorable evening, an entire layered cake, and the apartment smelled of brown butter and cardamom. He came in for water, stopped, looked at the situation, the flour, the bowls, her in an oversized hoodie with flour on her forearm and said, "You do this when you're upset." She looked at him. "How would you know that?" "Because the first time you did it was 3 weeks after we married, and I had said something unkind the day before." She set down the mixing spoon. "You noticed that. I notice things," he said. "I had assumed it went in one direction." Something shifted in the air. He didn't get his water. He stayed near the kitchen island, and she went back to what she was doing, and the silence had a different quality now charged, aware of itself. "What did I say?" He asked it with the careful casualness of someone who had been rehearsing the question. "You told someone at the Lim dinner that your wife was an arrangement, not a choice." She kept her hands moving in the dough. "I was standing close enough to hear it." She heard him inhale. "Maya, it's fine," she said. "It was true at the time. I'm not saying you owed me differently. I didn't know you heard. Would it have changed what you said?" A pause. "I don't know." And then, more quietly, "I would like to think so." She looked up at him. He was 2 feet away, closer than he usually stood in domestic spaces, and his face was doing that complicated thing, the controlled surface with something underneath it moving against the seams. "You've been decent to me," she said, "in actions, if not always in words. I know the difference. I have not been," he stopped, started again. "I've been practical, functional. That is not the same as decent. Sometimes it's what you have to start with." He reached out, not quite touching her, his hand near her arm, a gesture arrested halfway. She looked at his hand. He looked at it too, as if he wasn't entirely certain it had moved without his permission. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I know. I was not taught to a breath invest, emotionally, in something that could be lost. I know that too. And you're still..." He stopped. "Still what?" He looked at her. His eyes were very dark and very direct, and for a moment she could see all of it, the years of closing, the discipline, the loneliness that had been stored in that careful, controlled body, like water behind a dam, and something that was beginning to look, against all his engineering, like wanting. He said her name. Just her name. Differently than he'd said it before. And then his phone rang. The sound was industrial in the silence. He stepped back one clean step, the professional reflex, and looked at the screen, and she saw him make the decision to answer it, to return to the world that expected him, to step back into the structure. He answered the call. He walked out of the kitchen. She turned back to the dough. Her hands were not quite steady. She understood why he'd stepped back. She understood the fear underneath the stepping back. She held this understanding with care, with kindness, because she was that kind of person. But understanding did not mean waiting forever. And she was beginning to feel the particular weight of wanting something she was not certain she would receive. Month 18. Her father called to tell her that a business investor, a former client of Maya's PR firm, someone who had always admired Raymond Davis's energy and wanted to take a second swing, had offered to buy out the remaining debt structure. The Jeong family would be paid. The business license would be secured by different means. Raymond was crying. He didn't often cry. He said her name 3 times. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the Han River and thought, this is what the 2 years were for, and they're not even done. And now the contract had no floor. She went to find Jae-Won that evening. He was in his study, the room she rarely entered, his most private space, and he looked up when she knocked on the open door. She told him, laid it out simply, the way she did everything. He was quiet for a long time. "The terms of the contract specify," he said slowly, "that if the financial basis is resolved before the 2-year term, either party may choose to dissolve the arrangement." "Yes, is that what you want?" She looked at him. She thought about the garden. She thought about the kitchen. She thought about 11:30 on a Sunday, and his hand arrested in the air between them and her name in his voice in a way it hadn't been before. She thought about the phone call that he'd taken, about all the times he'd stepped back from the edge. "What do you want?" she asked. He looked at her. The lamp in his study cast a warm light, and he was in shirt sleeves, and he looked for a moment. One of those unguarded moments she'd been collecting, like found objects, like someone standing at a crossroads he hadn't expected to reach. He said, "You've never asked me to stay." "I'm not asking you to stay. You're asking what I want." "That's different," she said. "If you want something, you do the work for it. I'm not going to ask you to want things." He stood up. He was 3 feet from her and then 2, and she thought, this was it, this was the moment, and something in her went very still and waiting. "The contract protected us both," he said. "If I extend it, it's not a contract," she said clearly. "If we stay, it's not a contract. That's the condition." He looked at her. His breathing had changed, she could see it, the slight lift of his chest, the control that was slipping its own leash. "Maya," he said. "I know," she said, and then, "I'm not built for this to go wrong." "Neither am I." She held his gaze. "But you have to decide whether fear is a good enough reason to never start." He stood there and did not speak. And she waited exactly as long as she was willing to wait, and she knew her own limits, had always known them. And when the silence went past that line, she said, quietly and without cruelty, "I'll start looking for my own place." She walked out of the study. He said nothing. She found an apartment in Mapo, not the studio. Something better. Something that felt like it was hers, and she moved in on a Thursday in the 7th month of year 2. Jae-Won was at the penthouse when she left. He did not help her with boxes because she had not asked and he had not offered. He stood near the kitchen, she saw him, as she passed with the last bag with a coffee cup that had clearly gone cold, his expression composed and unreadable in a way that she knew, now, was the opposite of fine. She left. She started cooking in her own kitchen. She called Kezia, and they ate dumplings from the Pojang matcha across the street. She called her father, and they talked for an hour. She went back to her work with the particular focus of someone who had put something down and was remembering what her hands felt like empty. She was okay. She was not quite the okay she'd been before, because she'd put things down before without feeling them go. And this was different. But she was okay. 3 weeks after she moved out, Kezia introduced her to someone, a colleague, a Korean-American architect named Daniel who had easy warmth and a good laugh and who looked at Maya with uncomplicated interest. They met for coffee. It was pleasant. He texted to ask if she wanted to get dinner. She said yes, because she was not going to hold herself in stasis for a man who had stood in silence at the crossroads. She went. It was fine. More than fine. Daniel was genuinely lovely, perceptive in his own way, curious about her, didn't flinch when she took up space. She laughed twice at dinner, real laughs, and thought, this is what uncomplicated feels like, and felt, about that. Something that was relief and grief at the same time. Jae-Won heard from his sister. Jae-eun called to inform him, with the particular satisfaction of a younger sibling delivering deserved consequence, that she'd run into Maya at a restaurant, and Maya had looked wonderful. And also, she'd been with someone. And also, that someone was very handsome. Jae-Won thanked his sister and ended the call. He sat in his study in the apartment that had the correct music and the wrong weight, and he thought about a kitchen at 11:30, and a garden in Seongbuk-dong, and a woman who had looked at him in a way that no one in his life had ever looked at him, without wanting something from him, without calculating, without holding the entirety of their warmth and reserve as negotiating leverage. He thought about the container in the dish rack. Clean. Returned. He had not earned anything she'd given him, and he had let her leave. And he opened his laptop. He did not answer the 12 emails that needed answering. He sat there. His father called. He let it go to voicemail. He thought, I don't know how to do this. And then, for what might have been the first time in his adult life, he thought, but I could learn. She was at dinner with Daniel when Jae-Won walked in. She saw him before he saw her, a table near the window. Her and Daniel and a bottle of wine they'd been sharing over a conversation about Seoul's Han River development and whether it served the city or erased it. She saw the door, and she saw him. And for a moment, she felt the complicated geography of her chest rearrange itself and then settle back into position, because she was not a woman who let her feelings run ahead of her. He saw her. He stopped a full, visible stop, the kind he didn't usually permit himself, and for a moment the restaurant continued around him with its noise and warmth while he stood still at the entrance. She watched him make a decision. He walked toward her table. Daniel saw her eyes track something and turned. He didn't know who Jae-Won was, not specifically, but he had the instinct that people have when a room's gravity shifts, and he went quiet. Jae-Won stopped at the edge of their table. He looked at her. He did not look at Daniel in the way of a man issuing territorial signal. He looked at Daniel the way someone looks at a fact they have to acknowledge. And then he looked back at her. Can I? He started. Daniel, she said. Would you give me a minute? Daniel, who was perceptive, excused himself to the bar with a generosity she appreciated. Jae-Won sat down in the vacated chair. He was in a suit. He was always in a suit, but he looked slightly undone around the edges, as though he'd come here directly from somewhere and hadn't stopped to recalibrate. He started. Stopped. Started again. I'm not good at this. I know. I don't mean that as an excuse. I mean it as He pressed his hands flat on the table. A gesture of grounding, she thought. A man who was not sure he could get through this without something to press against. An acknowledgement of a deficit that I intend to work on. She looked at him. She was not going to help him. This was his to do. He looked at her directly, in the way he'd begun to do in the last months of their arrangement, the way that felt like being actually seen rather than appraised. The night you left, he said. I was a breath. I was afraid. Not of you. Of what would happen if this was real, and then it ended. I have lost things. He stopped. I have not lost things I let myself want, because I stopped letting myself want them, and I told myself that was discipline. Another stop. It was not discipline. No, she said quietly. It was fear. Yes, he held her gaze. And I stood there, and I let you walk out because I was afraid. And I have thought about that. He looked at his hands extensively. Have you? Every day. And not in the way of someone cataloging regret, in the way of someone realizing that the cost of his voice shifted, dropped, of not having you in that apartment, of not hearing you in the kitchen, of the refrigerator having nothing in it that was left for me. The cost of that has been, he stopped, considerable. Maya was very still. I knew you were paying attention, she said, to the food. Of course I was paying attention. Something moved across his face. A flicker of feeling that was not under control. I paid attention to everything. You knew that. You saw that I did. I did. And I still... He stopped himself. I need to say this differently. He met her eyes. I'm in love with you. I was in love with you before I knew to call it that. And I let you leave because I didn't know how to ask you to stay without a contract to put between us. And I understand now that was... He looked for the word... cowardice. The restaurant continued around them. Glasses clinked. Somewhere, someone laughed. Maya looked at Jeong Jae-Won, who had called her an obligation on the night they married, who had stood in silence when she'd needed him to speak, who had eaten everything she left for him and returned the container clean every time. She thought about the garden. She thought about his name in her voice, the night in the kitchen, the fault line in his face. She took her time. I need you to understand something, she said. He was very still. I'm not a problem you solved. I'm not a thing you misplaced and are here to collect. She held his gaze. If you come back into my life, it is not a contract. It is not an arrangement. You show up all the way or you don't. I don't do halfway. I know, and I am exactly who I am. I'm not going to become easier to look at by your family's standards, or softer, or more manageable. I cook at 11 at night when I'm anxious, and I read people in ways that make them uncomfortable, and I'm not going to apologize for any of it. I would not ask you to. And this time there was something in his voice, not quite emotion, but the sound that emotion makes when it's too large for the container and is pressing against the sides. You are exactly as you are, the only person who has ever... He stopped. You don't want anything from me. I want things from you, she said. I want honesty. I want presence. I want you to show up in the parts of your life that aren't scheduled. Those are not small things. No, they aren't. A breath. I know that. And I'm not going to decide tonight, she said. He nodded slowly. You have to prove it. Not with words. You've given me enough words for one evening. She looked at him steadily. Actions. Over time. Without a deadline. She paused. Do you understand? Yes. Daniel is a good person, and I'm not going to be unkind to him to make a point. I understand. She looked at him one more moment. Then she said, very quietly, you look like a person that night in the living room, when you forgot I was there and you were just reading. I had never seen you like that before. He looked at her. That's the person I'm interested in, she said. Not the chairman, not the contract. That person. Bring him. She stood. She went to the bar and told Daniel honestly that she owed him an explanation over coffee sometime. And Daniel, who was genuinely lovely, took this with grace and genuine kindness, and she appreciated him for it. Jae-Won was still at the table when she came back. She picked up her coat. You know where I live, she said. She walked out. He showed up. Not immediately, she would have been suspicious of immediately, but with the consistency of someone who had made a decision and was honoring it with the same discipline he brought to everything, turned now towards something that actually mattered. He came to her apartment in Mapo on a Saturday morning, without notice, with coffee from the place she'd mentioned once in passing that she liked. He sat at her kitchen table and drank his coffee, and she drank hers, and they talked for 2 hours without performing anything. Without a schedule, without a reason, except that they were choosing to be in the same room. He came back the next Saturday. He called her in the evenings, not every evening, not in the pressurized way of someone logging required contact hours, but in the uneven, genuine rhythm of someone learning what it meant to think of another person at the end of the day. He was awkward, sometimes. He said things wrong. He stopped himself once in the middle of a sentence and said, I'm not certain how to say this. And she said, try anyway. And he tried. He met her father. This was the one that mattered. Raymond Davis, with his big laugh and his big presence and his debt that had started everything, shook Jeong Jae-Won's hand in Maya's kitchen and looked at him for a long moment with the directness of a man who had been humbled enough to see clearly. You know what she gave up, Raymond said. It was not a question. Yes, Jae-Won said. And what are you going to do about it? Everything I can, Jae-Won said, for as long as she allows me to. Raymond Davis looked at his daughter. Maya gave him the small nod that meant, I'm okay, Daddy. He gave her the look that meant, you'd better be sure. She gave him the look that meant, I am. He shook Jae-Won's hand again, harder. Good coffee, Raymond said, pointing at the cup Jae-Won had brought. You learned that from her? She taught me, Jae-Won said, to pay attention. One evening in spring, they were walking along the river, something they'd started doing, the easy, unscheduled kind of thing that Jae-Won had learned to make space for. And he stopped. She stopped too, looked at him. He was looking at the water, and he said, I want to give you a choice. Okay, you can have a real wedding, he looked at her, if you want one. Something that is not what that was. A pause. Or we can just be what we are. I don't need the form of it. I just need, he searched for the word, the substance. She looked at the river. The spring air had the smell of things beginning, that particular green and water smell that felt like permission. Ask me properly, she said, and we'll see. He turned to face her. He was not elegant about it. He was not practiced at this, and it showed, and she loved that it showed. He took both of her hands in his. I want to try, he said. All of it. A life with the noise in it. I want to come home to your kitchen at 11 at night. I want to sit in gardens with you without anything to say. I want, his voice, controlled for so long, was doing something at the edges. I want to earn it. every day, for as long as you'll let me." Maya looked at him for a long time. This was not the man from the wedding night. This was not the man who had stood across the room with his phone. This was the man from the living room when he'd forgotten to be what he was supposed to be. The man in the garden who had admitted that he was lonely. The man who had returned every container, always clean, who had paid attention when he didn't have to, who had learned slowly, incompletely, with effort that love was not a transaction. "Yes," she said, "just that." And he held her hands and looked at her, like someone who finally understood the cost of what he'd almost let go. The second wedding was small. 15 people. Kezia in a burnt orange dress. Jae-un laughing at the vows. Raymond Davis trying not to cry and failing magnificently. Park Se-yeon in a blazer, looking quietly moved in the way of someone who has watched something broken slowly become whole. Maya wore ivory again, her choice. Deliberately. A different dress, her locks loose around her shoulders, gold at her ears, nothing at her throat. She looked like herself. She looked like herself, fully arrived. When the officiant asked Jae-Won if he would take Maya as his wife, he said yes, one word. But he said it the way he now said things that mattered, looking at her directly, with everything visible. And when they were asked if there were vows to share, he said, very quietly, into the particular quiet of a room holding its breath, "I spent most of my life learning not to want things. You unlearned that in me, without trying, just by being exactly yourself. I don't have a word in any language I speak for what that cost you, or what it means that you stayed long enough to teach me. All I can offer is the rest of it every year, fully, with nothing held back." Maya looked at him. She thought about what it means to be seen, truly seen, not the version of you that people project, not the useful version, not the strong one who holds things so no one else has to, but the actual you, the whole one, the one that shows up in kitchens at 11 at night and reads people in ways that make them uncomfortable and refuses to become smaller for anyone. She thought, here is a man who finally learned to see. She said, "I know who you were when I married you the first time, and I know who you are now, and who you're still becoming. I'm not afraid of any of those people. I choose all of them. They didn't have a long honeymoon. They went to Jeju for 5 days, and they walked on the coast, and they ate very good food." And Jae-Won read his book in a way she'd learned to recognize as happiness, that particular absorption, that permission he gave himself in her presence to simply be in a moment, without calculating it. She watched him from across a table one afternoon and thought, this is what I wanted. Not the big gesture, not the grand proof. This. The ordinary miracle of a person who had learned to choose presence. She took out her book. She read. Outside, the ocean said everything that didn't need to be said. Some people come into your life as obligations, and some obligations, carried long enough, with honesty enough, and courage enough, become the thing you were waiting for all along.